Hi, and welcome back to the Learning to Code by Writing Space Invaders course. This is the second part of lesson number 9, where we've been looking at arrays and how to use them to store data and how to step through the elements of an array. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at automatically loading data into our array and working with that. And you're going to have a go at programming this bit of the code yourselves. So let's get straight into that. The first thing to do is to load your lesson 9 program so that we're ready to start, and we'll jump then straight into the code. Our array code at the moment then defines an array called fruits, and then we set it to an array using these curly braces, and then we're adding a number of elements into that array using these strings. And we're then using their tick function to simply print out how many elements are in the array. So using this hash and then the array name. And then we're printing out each of the individual elements of the array. And if I run that, we have our 7 elements and then all of those elements listed. So that's where we got to at the end of the last lesson. But at the moment, when we are declaring our array, so when we create the variable, that's called declaring it, we are then initializing it. In other words, we're setting up its contents, and that's called initialization. So we're setting up its contents here to these number of string literals. Okay, so a literal is where you have physically typed in a number or a string. So that's embedded within the code. But we're using string literals, and we're creating our array straight off here, and that's what it's going to be then. It's going to contain these values. And that's one of the methods we use in our software. Quite often we do need to have an array of, say we had various options at the start of a game, whether you want to play at expert level or beginner level or normal level. You might define an array. Arrays are very useful for holding lists of things, so we could actually define this list of things or list of game options as an array at the start of our program, and then use that later on to display that to the user. But if we think back to our bullet code, when we were looking through that, we decided that we would need to have an array of bullets, but that we'd need to fill that up from our software with actual bullet objects. So instead of typing everything out in this way as a literal and actually typing out every individual bullet object, we want a way of creating our array and then getting our software to fill things in for us. And what that has the advantage of then is that we can, in our software, define how many objects are going to go inside it. So at the moment, every time we want to add or subtract an element from this array, we have to come in and edit our software and then work it out from there. But if we start using code to generate the contents of our array, we can use variables to control that action, and we can then do some clever things. So let's rework this bit of code then to create an array that's going to store the squares of the first set of numbers. And we're going to be able to control how many squares it stores by setting a variable. So let's start off and get our stuff ready. So we're going to have a new variable called squares, and this is going to be an array. Now we could of course come in here and start typing out 1, 4, 9 and so on, and actually type in the square values. But again, as we've just discussed, that then sets up the array, and we're really fixed with that. It becomes harder to add things and take things away from that in a sensible manner. So what we need to do is we need to start off with an empty array, and that's done by just putting in an open curly brace and a closed curly brace, so nothing in between. So this declares our variable. So we create the variable called squares. We set it equal to an array, so it will now have all the properties of an array, but there's nothing in it. So let's just update our printing out function down here. So again, we're now working with the squares array. So we need to be counting how many elements are in the squares array and then printing out the elements from the squares array. So if we run that using Control R, we get pretty much what we should have expected. So it's saying that there are 0 elements in the array and it's trying to print them out, but of course there's nothing there. So if we go back into our code, let's start thinking about how we can actually get some values into this array. So we know that we're going to have to initialize this array, and that needs to happen at the start of our code. So somewhere at the start of our tick function, we'll need to do this block of code to put the numbers inside our squares array. And as this is going to be a separate little block of code, we're going to put it in its own little function. So let's call the function init squares. So we'll make a call to this function at the start of our tick code. And then down the bottom here, we'll need to declare that function. So function init squares, and then we end our function init squares. So our code's going to start here. It's going to declare our squares as an empty array. And then as soon as our tick function runs, we're going to call init squares. And down here, we're going to then put some values into our squares array. So let's try and work out how that's going to happen. So when we first start off, our squares array is completely empty. So we need to create the various slots in it. So each indexed slot in our array needs to be created, and we need to put the square of a number in that. So at the moment, we don't know how many elements we need to create. So let's use a variable to control that. And let's call this variable num square, so how many squares we want to create. And let's start off by setting that to, say, 15. So we're going to create the squares of the first 15 numbers. We know that we can use a for loop to count through each of those numbers. So we could count for counter equals 1 to num squares. And we then know that if we're doing that, then inside our loop, this expression, so squares counter, will point us at the element whose index is set by counter. And we can then put values inside that slot, so we can initialize that element by setting squares brackets counter equal to something. And again, we're going to be then setting it equal to the square of the counter value. Remember, square is just the number times itself, so counter times counter. So all of that's going to happen inside our init squares function. So why don't you have a go and see if you can create that function. So again, it's going to be a for loop. It's going to fill up the squares array with the first 15, and again the 15 is set by that value, the variable num squares, and it's going to put those values into the array. And if you run it then, of course, because we've got all of the printing set up, you should be able to see those values going in. Okay, so have a go. I'll put a 5-second counter on this and we'll see how you get on. Hi again. If you've managed to get this working, brilliant, and you should now have it printing out the 15 square numbers. If not, great for having a go. We're going to go through now and see exactly how that's done. Remember, all of these little exercises are to help you learn to code, and making mistakes is actually one of the best ways you can do it, because you'll start to see where you're going wrong and then start to better understand how to fix it. So let's go through how we're going to do this then. So we've seen again, we've declared our variable here. We've said we're going to use this variable num_squares to tell us how many to do. So our function down here, so we're going to use a for loop to count through all of our indexes. So we're going to count from 1 to this value num_squares. And that's our for loop. And that's the end of our for loop. So inside our for loop, we're simply going to access our squares array. We're going to look at the element whose index is counter. So again, at the start, squares counter won't exist. So we need to initialize that by setting it equal to or giving it a value of. And the value we want is the square of the current number, which is just simply going to be counter times counter. So our for loop will count from 1 up to num_squares. This variable will hold that count. So in this line here, we take our squares array. We are talking or accessing the counter indexed slot. And we're going to put in counter times counter, which is the square of the current one we're working on. And really, that's it. That should then initialize our array to the first 15 square numbers. So if we run that, there we have our 15 elements, and we have 15 square numbers. If you didn't manage to get that one by yourself, again, don't worry, but do go into the code and do make sure you update yours with this block of code, and have a look and see where you went wrong using your counters and your for loops and so on. So just help you understand where you made a mistake and how these things do work. So if we now look at our code, there is actually a slight issue with this. And I'm going to put a bit of code in here which is going to help us see that problem. I'm going to create another variable up here, and I'm going to call this initCount, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. And what we're going to do is inside our initialization function, I'm going to just simply update that counter by 1. So I'm going to say initCount equal to initCount plus 1. So in other words, this is going to tell me how many times this function has been run. And up here, after we clear our screen, we're going to put in a print statement, and we're going to print this value, so initCount, and we're going to print it at the in the middle of the screen, so 120 across, and at the top of the screen. So if I run this code now, what we should find is that we have our array printed out down the left hand side, but we now have this number over in the middle of the screen which is telling us how many times that initSquares function has been called. And you can see that it's being called a lot of times, and if I go back into the code, we'll see exactly why that is. Our initSquares function is being called every time our tick function runs. And of course the tick function runs 60 times every second. So we are initializing our array every single time our tick function runs. Now if we think to what we're going to be using this for in our Space Invaders code, we're going to be creating an array which is going to store the player bullets. And each of those player bullets is going to be an object which we're going to use to fire a bullet up the screen. So the values inside that object are going to change as we fire a bullet and as it moves up the screen and as it's taken off the screen. So we will eventually have a function which will be init player bullets, and that will reset all the bullets to their starting values. And can you see that if we run our player bullet initialization function every single time our tick function runs, we're never going to be able to fire a bullet up the screen, because as soon as we fire it, our initialization code will run again and set everything back to its starting value. So what we need to do is we need to create a way in which our initialization, so when we initialize our variables, it will only happen once at the very start of our program, and after that it won't run anymore. So you're going to have a go at doing this. I'm going to give you a couple of hints on this. We've seen before that we can use things called flag variables. So I'm going to create a variable called initComplete, and this is going to tell the system if we have run the initialization or not run the initialization. So to begin with, we haven't run the initialization, so it's going to be set to false. This line of code here is the initialization code, and that should only be run at the very start when our initComplete is false. After that, we need to make sure that we signal that the initialization has been run and then stop it running anymore. So again, a hint here again is you're going to have to think about an if statement, but have a go at that, see if you can work it out, and I'll give you a bit of a countdown and then we'll work out how it's done. So see you in a second. Okay, welcome back. So if you've got that working, what you should find is that if you run your code, that this counter number, the number that's telling us how many times the initialization function has run, should only count up to 1 and then stop. So that's your indicator as to whether you've got it working or not. If not, don't worry, we're going to go through it now and see how it's done. So as I said, we've got this flag variable which is going to tell the system if we have run the initialization. So if the initialization is complete, that will tell us whether it is or not. So at the moment when we start, it isn't complete, so we set it to false. The line of code we want to put that around then is this init squares function. So we want to do an if statement, and we want to say if init complete. So if our flag has the value false, then we want to do our initialization, which is that line there. And then we need to end our if statement. But if we simply do that and then I run it, you can see that it doesn't actually stop it running again. And that's because we obviously haven't signaled to the system that the initialization is complete. And we do that by setting our flag then. So init complete, complete. And when it is complete, we need to assign a value of true. So when we first run, we say that initialization is not complete. This line of code says if initialization is not complete, then we run our initialization. But after we've run our initialization, we say initialization is now complete. So the next time round, our statement here says, do we need to run this line of code anymore? And the answer will be no, we don't want to run that line of code anymore. So if I run this, we should now find that our code is running and we've only run our initialization once. Okay. So that's how we mask off this line of code from running a second time. And we've now got the idea of how we can initialize our array using software and using this function down here to actually initialize it. So let's take this code across into our main Space Invaders program and see how we can apply it in there. So first off then, let's make sure that we save this code. So coming out here, and I'm going to save this as squares. Oh, I'm even going to spell it right. It's squares. I've got real problems today. Squares, there we go. So save that as squares. Okay, again, I've obviously already been playing around with this, so I'm going to overwrite that. So once we've saved it then, we need to load in our lesson 8 code and go into that, and we can then start working then on our Space Invaders program. So to start with then, let me just come in here. This is now lesson number 9. And let's just save that so we don't overwrite any of our previous work. So I'm going to escape out and I'm going to save lesson 9. So that keeps all of our previous work safe while we do our updates for this block of code. So let's start modifying the code to give us multiple bullets then. So looking through what we've got at the moment, so our player ship, obviously, that all stays the same. And things like bullet offset, that's going to be the same for every single bullet. Remember that's tied into the design of our ship rather than our bullets. But our player bullet variable then, this is where we're going to make some changes. At the moment, we are creating a player bullet variable and we are initializing it with this set of values. Okay, so that creates a brand new bullet object. Now we're going to need that block of code because when we're going to create our 5 bullets, if that's what we're going to create, we need to initialize each one to the correct set of values. So in effect, we've already worked that bit out. So let's have a look underneath here then about how our new system is going to work. So we're going to leave this bit in just for now, just so we have that code saved there. But we know that we're now going to create an array to hold our bullets. So let's call our array player bullets. And we've seen already that we can set that to be an empty array because we're going to fill that up when we initialize our values. So there we have our variable player bullets ready to hold that array. We now know that we need to set another variable which will tell us how many player bullets we're going to have, as this is the maximum number of player bullets we're going to have on screen. So we'll call this one max player bullets, and we'll initially set that then to 5. So we've got our array, we've declared our array variable player bullets, and we've declared and initialized our max player bullets variable, which will tell us how many bullets we need to allow for. So down here a bit, but we'll put it at the end then. Okay, so down here we're going to create our initialize bullets function. So let's define that function here. So function, and we are initializing the player bullets array. And then we end our function, and let's just copy that down so we know that this end matches up with that function. So inside this function then, we're going to need to create these numbered slots inside our player bullets array, and then we'll need to put in a initialized bullet object into each slot. So we'll take you through this one. So our for loop And we could say for bullet, so we'll use bullet as our counter in this one. It's going to go from 1 to max player bullets. And it's going to do. So again, by using this variable max player bullets, we can decide how many bullets we want it to create. And then we do our end, and that's the end of our for loop. And inside this then, we want to take our player bullets array. We're going to be initializing the element which is pointed to by our bullet variable. So remember, the bullet variable is the one that's doing the counting. So the first time round, that will be player bullets number 1. So the number 1 slot in the array, and then 2, 3, 4, and 5, because we've got 5 is the value for max player bullets. And we want to make that equal to our bullet object, which is going to go in there. So that's why we left the one at the top. So inside this area here, we need to put the actual data that creates a bullet object. So if we scroll back up the top, we can see here we're creating this is where we created our individual bullet. So this block of data, which contains position and so on, that's what we need to copy. So Control C to copy that, then back down to the bottom again. And that's what needs to go in here. So let's just tidy that up a bit. So that needs to be tabbed in a bit. And tabbed in. And that should be it now. Okay, so we've got our position object, our length, color, speed, and our active all inside our object variable. Okay, so we have our initialize player bullets array function. It's going to count through max player bullets, so that's going to be 5 at the moment. So the first 5 numbered elements in our player bullets array, and make each one of those equal to a brand new bullet object with all the information set up for it to be used as a fireable bullet. So we've got that function ready. It obviously now needs to be called at the start of the game. But we're going to have a think about how our game's going to develop over the while. So this function initializes just our player bullets array. But if you can think about it, we've got quite a bit of code to write for this game. So there's going to be lots of other things that are going to need to be initialized. So instead of having to list them all out in our tick function, what we're going to do is we're going to create another helper function for ourselves here, which is the overall game initialization function. So we're going to create a function called Initialize Game, and end that, and that is Initialize Game. And this is the actual function we're going to call at the start of the program. And what it will do, it will then decide which bits of the game need to be initialized. Remember, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to take the complexity out of our tick function and bury that down here so that we know that if we have a problem with our initialization routine, then we first of all will be looking here to see what is initialized. And then if it's our bullets that aren't initializing correctly, we'll know that it's then coming down to here. So we're creating these layers of code that we can work our way down through, and we're only ever then dealing with a small block of code each time. So our initialize game function, that's the one that's going to call all the individual initialization functions. So it will need to call this one, which will set up our bullets. And again, at the moment, that's the only one we've got. So just to make sure you got that in your heads, so this function, which we just wrote, that sets up the bullets and puts a new bullet object into our player bullets array. It needs to be called at the start of the game, but we know that we're going to have to do lots of other initialization at the start of the game, so we have a special function that's going to do all of that initialization. So at the moment, it's only calling our initialize bullets array function. But again, we'll be putting in, it'll have to initialize our alien bullets array and our aliens themselves and so on. There'll be lots of things that need to be initialized. So that will grow in complexity. But this then is the one which needs to be called at the start of the game. So let me just copy that name so I don't forget what it is. And we'll work our way up to top here and back up to our tick routine, which is here. Okay, so initialization happens before everything else. Let's give ourselves a space in here. And we know that we need to call our initialize game routine somewhere up here. Again, we know that that only needs to be called once at the very start of the game. So you should know what to do for that. And just so we keep everything all in the same names, I'm just going to copy in the name that I've used in the main game for this. So this is going to be the flag variable that's going to tell us if our game needs to be initialized. Okay, so again, think about the name that I've created here. It's slightly different to the one we had last time. So this flag is going to be true if the game needs to be initialized. So have a think about that. And obviously we're going to use that to control when this function gets called. So have a think about what we need to initialize this to, and then how we're going to test it to make sure that this line of code gets called at the start of the game, but we then use this flag to mask it off from being called after that. So I'll give you a countdown on that. Do have a go at working through these. Don't worry if you can't get them to begin with, because again, you are just started programming. But do have a try, because the more you try and the more you have a go at these things, the more it will sink in as to what we're doing and how it all fits together. So let me give you the 5-second countdown, pause the video and have a go at setting up the code around this statement that will make sure that our game is only initialized at the start and then not after that. So let me turn that countdown on for you. Okay, hopefully you've had a go at that. Let's see how it sort of fits together then. So our variable, which is this game needs to be initialized. So at the very beginning, the game does need to be initialized. So that needs to be set to true to tell us that we need to run the initialization code. So inside here then, so this is where we are, I put a note to myself here to check if the game needs to be initialized. Okay, so let me just go back to a smaller font size for this. So sometimes it's handy if we put little notes to ourselves, and these are called comments in our code, which tell us what's going on. So we're going to do a check to see if the game needs to be initialized. So if, and here we can put in our game needs to be initialized. So if game needs to be initialized, so by just using the variable name, that will either be true or false in itself. We don't need to test it being equal to a value, because it just is true or it is false, if that makes sense. If you're not quite sure about that, what in effect I am saying there is if game needs to be initialized has the value true, then we need to initialize the game. Okay, but because the variable itself is true, then that is also correct to do it that way. So it depends what way round you do it. This is the shorthand way. And again, the reason that we have the game, the variable chosen with this name is that name actually signifies the correct way round. So we can then have a statement. So if game needs to be initialized, then initialize the game. So hopefully you can see then how we're starting to make our code almost sound like it is an English statement. Okay, so again, that's just careful choosing of the way round the value works, so when it's true and when it's false, and the name we give it. So that gives us our if statement, but we also then know that we need to then stop it from happening a second time. So we then need to take our game needs to be initialized variable, and after we've done the initialization, we need to set it to be false. So we need to assign a value of false to it, so that the next time our tick function runs, then this variable will be false. So if game needs to be initialized, that will actually become false. So we then don't do the initialization a second time. Okay, so that's the code then to get our player bullets array initialized. Now at the moment we can't see that running really, because if you think about it, at the moment our game is working from this single player bullet variable, and all of the code's based around that. This player bullet variable now, we don't actually need that anymore, so we can delete it out. And we now have our bullet data stored inside this player bullets array, but we have our 5 bullets inside there. So we've got the array set up, and we've now got the array initialized. We now need to look at our bullet handling functions. So we have a number of functions here that handle firing a bullet, moving a bullet, and drawing a bullet. And of course these now need to be updated to cope with the fact that there could be 5 bullets on screen at the same time. So we've actually gone over an hour on this video. So we're going to leave it here for this lesson, and we'll fix these functions in lesson 10. So make sure you save your work. So I'm just going to hit Control S, because remember I had saved this as lesson 9 at the beginning of our work. So I'm going to save that as lesson 9. And I will see you in lesson number 10. See you soon. Don't forget to visit the course pages for this project. There you'll be able to download the code for this lesson and get lots of extra hints and tips. You'll also get access to all my other programming, electronics and gaming projects. All the links are in the description below. For more games programming, electronics projects and retro gaming, please make sure you like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel and visit my website.